Northern Virginia's vast and deeply connected transportation network features 32 metro stations, 21 Virginia Railway Express stations, 6 local bus systems serving 6 cities and 6 counties, along with hundreds of bike share stations and 2 major airports, all linking our region to the nation's capital and the world. But it wasn't always this way.
In the 1950s, the major U.S. investment in transportation was in what we now know as the interstate highway system. And a lot of people believed that cars were the future and that they could solve just about every transportation problem, and that transit was maybe had a limited role or completely obsolete, and that what America really needed was lots more highways. And what's interesting about Kennedy, and especially the people he appoints, is they did not agree with this general belief. They saw a greater role for subways and other rapid transit than had previous administrations.
Charlie Fenwick, in the old days, who was a state senator from Arlington County, was beyond the entire world as far as his looking ahead is concerned. He was deeply involved with starting the metro system with Virginia representative with Maryland and D.C. and in Congress. And he envisioned the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. I think there was one of his bills that created that.
That was 1964, the year the Virginia General Assembly established the Northern Virginia Transportation District and Commission, made up of the cities of Alexandria, Falls Church, and Fairfax, and Arlington and Fairfax counties.
He created the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission to represent Northern Virginia, and it's all elected officials on the idea that we would be responsible and responsive to our local jurisdictions and make sure that they got a fair shake. And NVTC was charged with providing the money or being the funneling for federal money and state money for the metro system and other transportation initiatives.
Washington has often been a laboratory for other cities, and so Johnson and his administration are interested in helping Washington build a rapid transit system that they hope will show the world what can be done in the 1960s with a lot of public investment and a lot of imagination. The first effort to fund Metro, or it wasn't called Metro then, but to fund rapid transit in Washington, basically failed in 1963. They just did not have the votes. It was going to come to a vote in December 1963. Obviously, the assassination of President Kennedy made that a terrible time to get anything done. And with plans under Johnson for a national level bill in 1964, people did not think that would be a great year to try to get something specific for the Washington region. So 1965 was the second try, and at that point they were able to get authorization for what was supposed to be a very small system. So this is the famous congressional tactic, the camel's nose under the tent, the one sip of whiskey, where you start with something small and then make it bigger. And once that bill is passed in Congress in 1965, the Maryland and Virginia folks who are interested in a more regional system and more regional government, they get more anxious to get their bills passed in Annapolis and Richmond to set up this compact. So the compact is eventually created in 1967, creating what we now call WMATA, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. On the Virginia side, this is the responsibility of the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, which is supposed to represent all the jurisdictions and has plenty of tugging and pulling within that group. And what they're looking for primarily is a way to serve the most number of people at the least cost.
For 60 years, NVTC has fulfilled that promise as a one-of-a-kind institution for regional transit cooperation.
At the time, I used to say that I understood that Metro was supposed to be this technological marvel, but I said, if it's a miracle, it's more a political miracle.
The jurisdictions weren't coordinating with each other. In some respects, they were competing. Other respects, they were duplicating efforts. And there was a clear need for the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. There had to be coordination. There had to be an overall metropolitan regional plan for transportation.
NVTC's first task was to help Virginia turn the dream of a regional rapid transit system into reality.
The first thing we did was the Shirley Highway bus. I was chairman of NVTC when we did that. We got And in those days, we got 90% federal money to do this. 90% federal money bought the buses, and the 10% were the local match was very little. Contracted with AB&W and ran the buses, and still is one of the most successful HOV bus operations in the United States.
The Shirley Highway Express Bus on Freeway project ran from 1971 to 1974 and was the first separated bus rapid transit route on an interstate highway during peak morning commute hours.
So many people live in Virginia, work in Maryland, and vice versa. During commuting period, those hours in the morning and the afternoon, it was just clogged. Employers were finding their employees were dissatisfied with the amount of time they had to spend commuting. So you had to have a body, the NVTC, that one coordinated, but secondly had an emphasis upon transit, upon the future.
Given the congestion and the imperative of creating alternatives for commuters besides the automobile. We also had air congestion, air quality issues, largely driven by the automobile that we wanted to address. But also there's the principle of being the biggest jurisdiction in the region and in the state. I felt it incumbent upon me as a member of the Fairfax Board to promote regional cooperation. You've got to work well with others to get to a place where you can have a plan that everybody buys into and that everybody can benefit from. I think NVTC quietly served as both a sounding board for new ideas, but also as a strong resource for developing alternative modes of transportation and being aggressive in identifying funding sources.
The focus was on the metro rail system, of course, and all of the issues of financing and how the system should be built out in the three jurisdictions, Maryland, Virginia, and DC, which is quite a unique situation for transit systems, and the governance that is involved then gets much more complicated.
So there was residential opposition in DC, in Maryland, in Virginia, pretty much anywhere that Metro was planned. And a lot of that had to do with the traffic that stations would bring. That, again, is a valid concern, even if it's not necessarily one that we want to have overwhelm the others.
Well, the agreement was that a piece of the extension, both in the district and in Maryland, would be agreed to, but neither would be completed. And the Virginia extension, which was mostly yellow line at that point, was also not guaranteed. So everybody had risk, but exactly who had how much risk and when was really the fight, and it was a fight.
The Metro was originally supposed to go down the median strip of I-66 all the way through Arlington and serve as a commuter route for people from Fairfax. That was just what people were thinking about. You know, how do you get all those people in Fairfax to DC? Well, you just run this line straight down the 66 into the district.
The first metro stations opened in the District of Columbia in 1976, reaching Arlington a year later, with stations in Alexandria and Fairfax County opening in 1983.
Well, when the Orange Line opened and I participated in the opening at East Falls Church, I did something about having orange shoelaces because I think we walked over to the station to the opening. I was, of course, younger and fitter and more flexible in those days, but it was, as far as I was concerned, it was a big deal.
The 90s particularly, but that whole time I was doing this, is really what I call the golden age of transit transformation in Northern Virginia particularly, and the region in general, because of things like opening VRE. We opened VRE in that time frame. We finished Metro. The original plan, the 103 miles, was finished. And that led us to a whole new bunch of things to do, to implement, a lot of them through NVTC.
A lot of time was devoted to Metro, and then VRE was in its infancy, and so it was a germ of an idea when I first got on that board.
NVTC had discussed the potential of commuter rail service in Northern Virginia as early as 1964, but those efforts faced opposition from the freight railroads, whose tracks offered ready access to prime office locations.
It was a wild ride. Mafursa was a Brazilian company that was manufacturing the trains, and they were taking their good old time, at least from our perspective. We, of course, were all elected officials, and everybody was sweating it because the newspapers were all over us, especially the Journal. And they were kind of naysayers. They were, doubtful that we would be able to pull this off. And at the time, I was chairman of the VRE Operations Board, even though we had nothing to operate, but we were getting it ready. And so actually a visit from us, to the factory would get their attention.
By the summer of 1992, VRE was ready to start rolling on the Fredericksburg and Manassas lines, concluding a long and sometimes frustrating process.
Everything that could go wrong would go wrong. And so when we started, Amtrak went on strike. It was like the day before the VRE was supposed to start its inaugural service. And it was exciting. Everybody was, out at the station. There were green balloons and banners and elected officials and people in the community. And Tom Bishadny, who was our director for transportation at the time, he was a staff person for transportation in Fairfax County, and Tom tells the story of looking down the tracks and wondering, will anything show up? Because Amtrak was operating our VRE service. So there was a partnership between Amtrak and VRE, and Amtrak had gone on strike. And I don't know how it all got worked out, but sure enough, our train came down the track, and it was a big deal. And to this day, when I see a VRE train coming down the tracks, I choke up. It was like my child.
So that was the focus, and then as the metro rail system was building out, then the need for buses that would serve those rail stations came to the fore, and so there was a great emphasis on coordinating bus service, and NVTC was involved there.
The 6 bus systems that serve NVTC's district, as well as OmniRide, provide over 600,000 rides each week, with NVTC working hand in hand with all of the bus operators to foster innovation and regional collaboration in their operations.
Once these bus systems started going, then we had buses going at counterproductive places. And so NVTC sort of led the charge to get us to sit down and think about how all of our individual bus lines, like Dash and ART, and I can't even remember all the names, and the Fairfax Connector, which we already had, worked together as well as worked with Metro.
Q started as a partnership between the city of Fairfax and George Mason University in 1980. Alexandria's Dash started operations in 1985. Fairfax Connector began operations the following year, and Loudoun County took over responsibility for commuter bus operations in 1994, while ART began service in 1998. Throughout the establishment and growth of the local bus systems, NVTC fostered regional cooperation through times of crisis, coordinating emergency evacuation bus routes following 9/11, to times of opportunity in establishing the Smart Trip Fare Payment Network, to advances in zero-emission bus technologies.
When I started was right when the bus system was being restructured, basically to save Metrobus and work out a regional system where you could have the local services that were emerging in a lot of jurisdictions kind of blend with and become complementary to, rather than conflicting with the regional Metrobus system. So that was kind of the, on the bus side, what was happening. On the rail side, we were nearing the completion of the 103-mile system.
The completion of the 103-mile system wasn't the end of the line for Metro. A new station on the Red Line at Nome Gallaudet in the district opened in 2004, quickly followed by a Blue Line extension in Maryland. But far more ambitious plans were being laid in Virginia, building on NVTC's efforts to bring rail to Dulles International Airport.
When I first ran for a local government office, I made reviving rail to Dulles my top priority. And at the time, it seemed like a fool's errand. People had tried and just failed. And I was counseled, that's a losing enterprise. You're going to embarrass yourself. You won't be able to keep that commitment. And I was bound and determined to revive it. But from my point of view, not having transit in the single biggest and most important economic corridor in the region, namely the Dulles corridor, would be self-defeating for everybody in Northern Virginia and would, frankly, compromise the promise of that corridor. So it had to be connected to the core metro system. When we started building the Silver Line, only 17,000 people lived in Tysons. 150,000 people commuted into Tysons to work at precisely the same time every morning and went home at precisely the same time every night, and we were puzzled about congestion. So building a place that's 24/7 with a grid of streets that's environmentally cutting edge too, and that has 100,000 people living in it, is going to transform quality of life in Tysons. And it will no longer be sort of a 9-to-5 place.
Throughout NVTC's 60 years, the organization persevered through challenges and external threats, sometimes coming from those not understanding NVTC's important role in the region.
Over the course of the years, several times there were proposals made and efforts made to do something with NVTC, to merge it with other agencies, to do away with it altogether, to alter its membership, to change the way that the region is represented through NVTC at the Metro Board itself. There were changes made legislatively and administratively at the state level about how NVTC received its money, for example.
We have a soup mixture of acronyms and transportation organizations, and if you don't follow them and you don't understand their specific niche and their specific purpose, it's easy to say, well, why don't you just have one and let them do it all? And we would have multiple times where Richmond became, then the General Assembly or the governor, became a significant factor in this organization, NVTC, being able to accomplish its mission and do its work. So I remember going to testify in different hearings and trying to explain the difference between NVTA and NVTC.
They kept trying to say you don't need NVTC and NVTA, and we had some Republican legislators who were on the commission at the time who just felt there was redundancy. And honestly, there were all the issues around VRE ownership and having to redo all of the underlying legal situations that I think in the end that proved to be our trump card of why it shouldn't happen. The cost associated with it would have just been outrageous.
30 years after NVTC used federal money to help promote the launch of the Washington Flyer ground transportation services to Dulles International Airport, Phase 1 of the Silver Line opened in 2014, with 5 new stations running to Tysons and terminating at Wheelie-Reston East.
We were able to do Phase 1 in fairly expeditious time, but Phase 2 took a lot of persuasion and a lot of work and rolling up your sleeves and trying to talk to people. And that delayed, that's one of the contributing factors to the delay of Phase 2 on the Silver Line, which we finally opened. I step back and I think about this, all that we went through to get it, because after we finally got the tax district, then we had to deal with the Bush administration that didn't like transit. And they were looking for any reason to kill the project.
Building the Silver Line to Dulles and beyond meant adding a new jurisdiction to the Metro Compact, as well as adding a new jurisdiction to NVTC, the first since Metro was originally envisioned.
I was reminded of the fact that whenever I would leave the NVTC meetings, usually Kathy Hudgens, who was the other representative from Fairfax and was on the board and was one of my colleagues, she and I would always take the Metro back to Reston after our NVTC meetings. But we were the two who actually went out to Loudoun County to meet with the Board of Supervisors out there to impress upon them the importance of Loudoun being supportive of extending the Silver Line to Loudoun and what the economic development opportunities would be for them, as well as just providing transportation for their residents. And I remember to this day how it was not an easy thing to do, to be honest with you. We had to switch a few votes out there, but we were able to get that done.
When I first came in office in 2012, I was one of 7 new supervisors, and we were immediately confronted with a discussion that really had been going on for decades, which was whether to be part of the extension of the Silver Line. And all of the region's planning really had been centered around the Silver Line going up the median of the Dulles Toll Road and into Loudoun County, serving Dulles Airport and beyond. But our board at that time, just 6 months into office, had to make the decision whether to commit Loudoun County formally to that project. And it was a 5-4 vote. It was a very close vote. I'm the only supervisor actually left that cast that vote in either way, but fortunately on the prevailing side. And so, once we became part of the Silver Line project, I think it really formally connected us to the rest of the region when it came to transit and when it came to providing those kind of transportation options.
When Metro was extended to Loudoun, there would be a need for Loudoun to be paying, and so they would have access to the 2% gas tax at the time for NVTC if they were to join, and that would provide a funding source for Loudoun. But PRTC, the commission to the south of us, was also very interested in having Loudoun County join. And so there was sort of a courtship that went on.
I think the story of Loudoun's involvement in NVTC kind of mirrors our engagement in the region. Loudoun County, kind of considered on the outskirts of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, saw a lot of population growth, tremendous amount of population growth. And with that comes new options for transit and new needs and new demands from commuters. And so from the time that Loudoun County started our Loudoun County transit system until today, where we're part of the Silver Line, the Metro Silver Line, we've really become more and more engaged in the region, not just on the transit side, but as a job center, a population center, and I think one of the major places that people go in our region to recreate.
Phase 2 opened in 2022, bringing a 6-decade dream of connecting Dulles by rail to life. While the public often focused on construction and expansion of the Metro rail system, another issue has dogged Metro from its earliest days: the lack of a dedicated, sustainable funding source.
Dedicated funding for Metro has been a long time objective, and I think the reason that it's so complicated is because there's 3 states involved.
The challenge was to get transit money not as an afterthought in funding at both the state and federal level, but built into funding programs. But by the end of this period, it began to dawn on us pretty seriously that we didn't have a guaranteed revenue source for Metro. And that may sound familiar because now we've realized again, 20 years later, that we still don't have a guaranteed funding source for Metro.
I remember attending a meeting of the Washington Board of Trade at the Chamber of Commerce offices in downtown DC with representatives. They were CEOs from all the major corporations in the Washington area, especially from Virginia. And it was actually called by Chuck Bean at the Council of Governments, but it dovetailed perfectly with what NVTC was doing as well. And we had a very candid and frank discussion about strategies for getting the Virginia General Assembly to fund the Virginia's component of the capital investment. Northern Virginia is 40% of the state's GDP. And although many jurisdictions in Southern Virginia have no direct benefit of the system here, the fact that 25 cents of every dollar that we send to Richmond comes back to us, it's clearly in their self-interest to ensure that the economic health of the Northern Virginia region continues.
Yeah, I think the importance of NVTC to Metro funding is the level of expertise they bring to the table for Northern Virginia and how well they've represented us down in Richmond. I think the establishment of the WMATA committee here at NVTC has been a real shift in how we view and talk about Metro as a group, as a region, and I think that's been really, really important.
I think one of the big game changers for NVTC was when the state decided to do 66 inside the Beltway and to direct some of the toll revenue here.
There was a recognition that we needed to, particularly with I-66, approach it from a multimodal standpoint. And while there was a lot of pressure and interest in some of the citizens outside of the Beltway and being able to expand the highway capacity, we also knew that we had to expand transit access as well. So the thing that's so innovative about the commuter choice program on 66, which we were then able to also take to 395, was it was really the first time that we were able to take revenues that were generated by drivers and users of the corridor in their vehicles and being able to take that approach and say, okay, all the transportation improvements in this corridor are eligible for that too. And we also wanted to make sure that it wasn't the state making those decisions. So I'm really proud of those programs. I think that it's been not just a great improvement for transportation in Northern Virginia. I've started to see a lot of other states that are replicating that same approach. Colorado, Washington State even, they've recently announced some programs where they're looking at things on a much more corridor-wide basis and investing in multimodal improvements so that they're really focusing on person throughput through the whole corridor.
To date, NVTC has funded new bus routes, bike share, bus stop improvements, offered reduced transit fares, and helped build park and ride lots with investments totaling more than $178 million. As the network of public transit in Northern Virginia continued to grow and flourish, businesses took note of what transit meant for their economic development. In 2017, Amazon announced it intended to build a second headquarters and solicited proposals from cities across North America. A year later, the company announced it would create HQ2 in the Crystal City neighborhood of Arlington, which later took on rebranding as National Landing.
And they started out with a list of about 214, I believe it was, possible sites. So there was a lot of competition around the country on who's going to get the Amazon headquarters. That would be a huge economic development win for whoever got it. At one point, as we were trying to get people to decide, hey, how do we pay for these capital projects? Amazon says, okay, we're going to whittle this list down to 20 places. And as it turns out, one in the District of Columbia, one in Maryland, one in Virginia. So all of a sudden, the light bulb went off, and our legislative leaders realized, hey, wait a minute, if we work together, we have an opportunity to win this major project.
The real thing that we're trying to get at is kind of creating a tech corridor, right? With having Virginia Tech coming in and building their campus, with having Amazon a mile or two away, we're really trying to bring a lot of future jobs here.
The region's existing and planned transit network is credited with helping to seal the deal to move to Arlington. While the region's public transit agencies have faced a variety of challenges over the decades, none were quite like the rapid changes brought about by the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020.
The pandemic was a hard time for transportation. And, for bus service, for Amtrak, and it was real hard on VRE. People didn't want to, get into a vehicle and expose themselves. Buildings in Tysons, were empty. People didn't want to go into work. They were working from home, which is a good thing. It's sort of transformational, but it's changed the way people work.
The memory that I look back on is looking at our ridership numbers for WMATA about Q1 of 2020 and thinking, we have finally turned a corner. right? Metro had really struggled during a number of years with recovering ridership after major incident with a loss of life, needed track work, service disruptions. And finally, after those years of safe track, the significant investment in the system, an investment, by the way, that we all fought tooth and nail for in 2018, right, when we got that dedicated funding agreement, we were finally starting to see ridership come back. And then, of course, the world cratered, right? Public transit became a real focus of attention for people worried about the spread of the virus, especially in our more urban areas.
This focus on regionalism is increasingly important. Post-COVID, it makes it even more important because there's a lot of people working from home now. They are, doing things different in the way of travel patterns than they've done before. They're needing transit and transportation options at different times of the day that maybe aren't as conventional as the way we used to think. And so having all of our jurisdictions at the table talking together about what we're experiencing in our own backyards helps us be able to plan a more robust network of services for the people that we serve.
Work is underway to tackle the next major projects, like expanding passenger rail through major investments in rail and track to benefit VRE, as well as to improve bus service with bus rapid transit routes that cross communities. Work that started with discussions at NVTC and work that NVTC continues to have a strong hand in completing.
Another initiative that was going along at the same time was Longbridge. And every meeting we would get an update on Longbridge.
So for transforming rail in Virginia, it really refers to a statewide program that we had to expand passenger rail across the entire state. The long-term goal here is to separate freight and passenger so we can have a fully separated network.
Construction on the new Long Bridge is expected to be completed in 2030, with other work to expand rail capacity in Virginia either underway or in the planning stages. The future also looks different for buses, high-quality, high-performing routes known as bus rapid transit.
I've largely been a fan of BRT, my entire career, and I think it's, a sleeping giant in terms of what it can do. And there's been so much focus on rail, legitimately and for good reason. But if you look at what happened during the pandemic with bus ridership versus rail ridership, I think we have to understand that bus riders rely on bus transportation in ways that maybe even rail riders don't. And so I think there's a couple things here. One, from an equity standpoint, we can move our buses into communities that otherwise wouldn't have transportation much quicker, much more efficiently, and much more economically. The second thing is the flexibility of BRT compared to fixed rail is something that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to.
What's exciting about BRT is that the best scenario, right, is you've got this dedicated lane, you don't have to deal with traffic, and you can go more quickly on the BRT than you can if you were to get in your car. That's not always possible, and so what is exciting about the BRT is that where that is feasible and possible, we will be doing that.
NVTC has been deeply involved in planning for Envision Route 7, a bus rapid transit system connecting Tysons to Alexandria by way of Falls Church and Seven Corners. The Route 7 corridor is one of the most economically diverse in Northern Virginia and home to one of the most used bus routes in the region, making it a prime candidate for enhanced bus service.
It is a classic example of when I speak about the need to provide transit options for more and more people that are, 1, convenient, 2, affordable, 3, safe, and 4, reliable. That sums up the objectives of Route 7 BRT.
Thanks to NVTC, working with Alexandria Dash, we were able to, re-envision kind of what the bus system looks like here in Alexandria, and it was huge, right? We went from covering 20 or 30% of minorities, low income, and seniors to covering up in the 70 and 80 percentile of low income, people of color, seniors, disabled. So it was a dramatic shift in the coverage that we're doing.
I think that's what's so exciting is seeing kind of that movement forward and thinking about, even in my short time, 3 decades here of, Merrifield used to be just an old cinema, and before that it was a drive-in movie theater. Now Mosaic is looked at as the model for the way we want to do transit-oriented development, mixed-use development, and so many people looking at the ability to get somewhere but then get out of your car.
From NVTC's founding to today, we've seen the development of a thriving transit network serving more than 2 million people in Northern Virginia through metro rail, commuter rail, and bus systems, giving more people more options to get where they're going.
With Northern Virginia's population projected to grow 11% from 2020 to 2030, expanding public transit can help limit additional traffic congestion on our roads and highways. That comes in the form of evening and weekend service on VRE, more express buses on I-66 and I-395, I-95, more environmentally friendly buses in all of our communities, a network of bus rapid transit systems serving the busiest corridors in our region and connecting with each other, and Metro, allowing for easy transfers.
NVTC is the epitome of good regional coordination. When we sit in that meeting, we can have the largest jurisdictions, not only in Northern Virginia, but frankly in all of Virginia, and some of the smallest, all working together on an equal footing. And that's very, very important for the credibility of the organization and something that's in our DNA.
I see NVTC continuing to grow as an organization. Sure, perhaps in the number of staff, but really in our expertise. Beyond our solid financial management, our staff make it possible for us to understand how travel patterns are changing, what impact or benefits our systems are providing for the community and the environment, and how our systems can better serve the public. And yes, we are 100% focused on telling the story of why the Northern Virginia Transit Network, including Metro and VRE, needs to be fully funded and successful to serve our communities.
I'm proud to serve as NVTC's chair in its 60th year, and I know our regional successes wouldn't have been possible without the hard work of my predecessors and the 60 years of staff leadership at NVTC. As we look to the future, both the opportunities and challenges that will present themselves, I know that NVTC is and will continue to be the heart of public transit in Northern Virginia.